We are going to be exploring the story of Ruth today. And she is one of my personal favorites when it comes to women in the Torah. So I'm really, really looking forward to getting into this story together with you all today.
Good. Thank you.
Sure, of course. Before we begin, I'm curious to know, is there anyone on here with the name Ruth or a family member or someone close to you by the name of Ruth? Okay, well, on Zoom, your name is iPad, one who just raised her hand. So what's your name?
Ellen Ruth.
Ellen, there we go. Beautiful. So this is very apropos for the story that we're going to be discussing today. Excellent. So before we begin, I will mute you all just so that we don't have any echo. But as always, please unmute yourself if you want to ask any questions or join in the discussion. And we are ready to start. So we have traveled across many generations from the creation of the world when we started off learning about Chava, moving into future generations later on in the historical context of time, learning about Sarah and Rivka and Rachel and Leah. I know that you also already explored the beautiful life and lessons of Miriam, which takes place during the time period when the Jews were in Egypt and leaving Egypt. So today we are going to travel many years later during the time period of the book in the Torah called the Judges. So just for a little bit of context, the books of the Torah are in chronological order, beginning with the book of Genesis, Bereshit, and continuing with the subsequent books of the Torah. We have the 5 books of the Chumash, and all of those take place before the Jewish people enter into the land of Egypt. The Torah story ends when the Jews are at the end of their journey in the desert, when Moses passes away. Of course, the Torah is full of ideas and lessons and laws that are not specifically story related, but in context of the historical outline of the story, the 5 books of the Torah end at the point where the Jews are getting ready to enter the land of Israel. And the books of the prophets come after the 5 books in the Torah. We have the 5 Chumashim, which then lead into what is called in Hebrew the Nevi'im, the prophets. And there are many books of the prophets, starting with Joshua, Yehoshua, then moving into the Judges, the Shoftim. Then we have the books explaining and going through the life of Shmuel, the prophet, moving into the lives of Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, King David, King Solomon, the building of the temple, etc., etc. So the story that we are learning today takes place during the time of the Judges in the book of Shoftim. And the book of Shoftim, which we're not going to get into in detail today, but just to have an idea, is taking place during the time when the Jews are already settled in the land of Israel. They have already done the main job of conquering the land of Israel and settling into the land of Israel. The land has been divided and been settled by every tribe. And Joshua, Yehoshua, the leader, has already passed away. And during the book of the Shoftim, the Jews go through many different leaders known as judges who help the Jews stay on the path of righteousness, help them get back to their ways when they succumb to the evil inclination and begin serving idols and begin intermarriage. And it's kind of like a cycle that continues. The Jews become influenced to do the wrong thing and to stray from the path of holiness, and they end up becoming oppressed by a certain nation that rises to power as a result of their lack of connection with God, and they cry out to God and they repent. God sends them a leader to help them to fight off the enemies, and there's a period of good when everyone's doing the right thing and following in the right path. And eventually, when the leader passes away, the Jews fall back into the ways of sin, and the cycle continues. In fact, most of the book of Shoftim has this cyclical idea of doing the wrong thing and then repenting and coming back to the ways of God, and once again doing the wrong thing, which in itself tells us an incredible value of the Jewish people and our bond with Hashem, that Hashem is always giving us chances, no matter how many times we make the same mistakes. And the story of Ruth takes place during the time period when the leader of the Jews was the judge named Iftzan. Now, Iftzan, who, as we get into the story, we'll know also had another name, but in the context of the story of the Shoftim, he was called Iftzan. This was right after the period when Devorah was the judge, which I wish we had time to go through this story, but I highly suggest, if you're interested in fascinating women in the Torah, you look up the story of Devorah, because she was actually a female judge, a woman who led the Jewish people. And this story of Ruth takes place after that time. And to put it in perspective, if anybody knows a little bit more about Jewish history, it takes place before the story of Shimshon, of Samson. So it's during this time period, the Jews are settled in the land of Israel, and there is a famine in the land of Israel. It is a time period when the Jews are oppressed by Eglon, the king of Moab, and there was a very rich and important man from the Jewish community whose name was Elimelech. Elimelech was a very rich man, a very important member of the community, and at a time when most of the Jewish community was struggling with extreme poverty, they turned to the wealthy individuals for support. And Elimelech owned a large amount of property, and he could have easily supported his Jewish brothers, but he was extremely miserly, and he didn't want to give charity. And so he came up with a plan. If he's living in Israel, it looks terrible that he's not being generous and charitable with his poor Jewish brothers. So he decided to uproot his family. He took his wife, Naomi, and their two sons, Machlon and Kilion, and they moved away. They sold a large portion of their property. They moved away with their wealth, and they actually moved to the land of Moab. And in this manner, he didn't have to give charity. He didn't have to support his poor Jewish neighbors. And Elimelech came to the land of Moab with his wife and his two sons, and they are living there. Now, for his wife, this was not an easy lifestyle. She was a good Jewish woman. She wanted to be with her family back in Israel, but she followed her husband. And her sons were fraternizing with the locals. And you can imagine that the people of Moab were not the best company to keep, and they certainly did not have the good influence that Naomi would have hoped for her children to have. And with the combination of their father's selfishness and the influence of the people around them, the two young men grew into self-centered, very vain and physically only focused on the physicality of life individuals. And they end up becoming quite attracted to two young Moabite women. One of them was actually the princess of Moab, which tells us what an important family Elimelech and his wife and their family was, because the wonderful daughter of Eglon, the king of Moab, was attracted to Machlon, one of the sons of Elimelech and Naomi. And they get married. And Kilion marries another wonderful aristocratic woman from the Moabite tribe, Orpah. And Machlon and Kilion are now married to these two Moabite women who sort of took on somewhat of Jewish practice in order to marry them, but they obviously weren't really connected with godliness in any way. And these two women are now part of the family. And Elimelech passes away. The father of the family passes away. Susan, I see your hand. Do you mind if I wait just a moment and I'll get to your question? Elimelech passes away. Machlon and Kilion pass away as well, as a punishment for their vanity and the fact that they did not allow their wives to get pregnant because they were scared that their wives would be less beautiful and attractive if they would become pregnant and have children. So we could just imagine the type of young men these two were. And now Naomi is living a completely different existence. Susan, what was your question?
Are the Moabites idol worshippers?
Yes, 100%. They were idol worshippers. They were individuals who followed their leader, Eglon, who was oppressing the Jewish people. And they were definitely not of the good sort. We'll get more into who they were.
So the father, so Elimelech, he knew about all this before he moved his family there, but he didn't care?
Precisely. Precisely.
Thank you.
So Naomi is now living a completely different existence than she had originally started off with. She had been a good, happy, wealthy Jewish woman who moved with her family to Moab, attempted to keep their connection strong, but now she was a widow. She was completely bereft of family and possessions because her sons had squandered all of the riches that they had had. And Naomi is left with these two Moabite daughters-in-law, whom she loved, but also never expected to stay close with her. Specifically because Moabite converts were not accepted in the Jewish community. Now, there is a rule in the Torah that converts from the nation of Moab are not accepted in the Jewish community. And it was around that time that the rabbinical courts had enacted a law stating that only Moabite men were forbidden from joining the Jewish community. Women were allowed. This was a brand new rule. And most people still had a very negative attitude towards Moabite converts. And so Naomi makes the decision to return to the land of Israel. She has nothing keeping her in the land of Moab. She just wants to go home. She knows that a very bitter life awaits her when she returns to Israel, but she has no reason to stay. And she urges her daughters-in-law to go back to their homes. In fact, she tells them, go back to your families, marry people, you're young, you're childbearing, marry Moabite men, live a happy life, do what you want to do. You're not beholden to me in any way. And it is a very tearful, very emotional parting. And after much persuasion, Orpah takes leave of her mother-in-law and her sister-in-law, and she goes back home. But Ruth clings to Naomi and refuses to leave her side. In fact, the statement that she makes is very, very powerful. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see from inside what she says to Naomi to make it clear that she wants to be part of the Jewish nation. So as you can see here, in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16, Vatomer Ruth, Al tifkei bi la'azvech, lashuv me'acharayech, ki el asher telchi elech, uva asher talini alin, amech ami ve'elokayech elokai. And Ruth said, do not entreat me to leave you, to return from following you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. This is a proclamation that goes so much deeper than just a daughter-in-law who loves her mother-in-law deeply and doesn't want to leave her side. This is a proclamation that Ruth wants to not just live with her mother-in-law, but live the life that her mother-in-law has demonstrated while she had gotten to know her. Ruth had been living in the home of Elimelech, and she tasted the beauty of Judaism. She tasted the beauty of God and the Torah, and that was the life that she wanted. Now, Ruth was not oblivious, and she recognized that the life that she was entering was not as beautiful and shimmery and glitzy and glamorous as the life she had left behind. In fact, if anyone likes colors and painting and art, I want you to imagine two canvases, okay? And if it's not your thing, just humor me and try to imagine it. Imagine a canvas that is painted with gold and pink and purple and silver and all of the royal hues, shattered with bits of glitter and shine. Imagine a canvas colored like that with that color palette. Now take another canvas and paint it with black and gray and taupe, which are all beautiful colors, but smear those colors together and compare both canvases. Everyone has a different taste when it comes to art. And some people might want to hang the dull gray and brown one on their wall, and that's great. But if each canvas represented the beauty in a person's life, I would venture to say that we would like the life that is gold and glittery and colorful, because that is a beautiful life, a life of experiences, a life of glamour and enjoyment, versus the life of black and gray and brown, which seems to be drab and dreary and lifeless. Ruth had both canvases in front of her, and she could just as easily have grabbed onto the glamorous life by returning back to her palace, where she would have been welcomed back as the princess of Moab. Ruth was the daughter of the king. She was a woman who had it all. She could have gone right back into that lifestyle of ball gowns and fancy dinners and beautiful, beautiful experiences and all the riches in the world. She could have taken herself right back into that. And instead, she chose a life that would lead her to poverty, would lead her to living a life where she would be taking care of her frail mother-in-law. And more than just the physical challenges that would be part and parcel of living the life that she was choosing, she knew very well that socially and emotionally, it would be quite challenging for her as well. Because not only would she not have the riches that she was accustomed to previously, both when she was living as the princess and when she was living as the daughter-in-law of Elimelech, but she knew that nobody would accept her as a proud Jewish woman. Nobody would accept her as a righteous convert. So she would be an outcast. And that, I would dare say, would probably be even more challenging than being poor. And Ruth didn't just accept that lifestyle. She chose that life because she recognized that the glitz and glamour was worth nothing compared to the spiritual glitz and glamour that she was embracing by choosing to have a relationship with God. And so Ruth journeys back to the land of Israel with her mother-in-law, Naomi. In fact, it was a long journey. Naomi was not a strong woman, and Ruth had to support her along the way. And when they entered the land of Israel, right before they entered the land of Israel, Naomi offered her the chance to leave once again, but she was steadfast in her commitment to God. And Naomi and Ruth come back to the land of Israel. They are living in a small little hovel. They had sold all of their property that they had previously owned in Israel, and they were penniless. And when people met Naomi, they didn't even recognize her. Is this Naomi, the wealthy woman from the aristocratic, high-class Jewish family, the wife of Elimelech who left during that time? They didn't even recognize her now. And she actually said, no, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Mara meaning bitter, because my life is bitter. And they had nothing to eat. And Ruth offers to go out to the fields and collect some grain. Now, how would Ruth be able to get grain if they didn't have any money? Ellen, Ruth, I see your question. If you don't mind, I'm going to answer it in just a moment. And how would she be able to bring home food if she doesn't have any money? Well, in the land of Israel, there are very specific laws that are specifically explained in the Torah that keep in mind the poor people, specifically for people involved in agriculture. A farmer who has a field full of produce, specifically wheat fields, barley fields, there are certain laws specifically pertaining to these farmers. Some of those laws include that a corner of a field should not be harvested, so that if a poor person needs food, they can take from the corners of the field. The same applies if a bundle of wheat or a bundle of whatever produce it is forgotten during the harvest. The farmer is obliged not to go back and take whatever has been forgotten, but just to leave it there for the poor. And the same as if while harvesting, a bundle falls and it is dropped along the side, it should also be left there for the poor. And so there were many poor people who would come to different fields and they would take from whatever was dropped or whatever was left or whatever was left in the corners so that they would be able to bring home a morsel of food. And Ruth offered to go join those throngs of poor people and gather some grain to bring back to her mother-in-law. And at first, Naomi was very reluctant to let her go. She said, "You are from a royal family. I can't let you do something like this. And you are a beautiful woman. What if the men take advantage of you or rob you or worse?" But Ruth was insistent that she go get grain to bring something back for her mother-in-law to eat. Now, to answer your question of why Orpah didn't go back, Orpah didn't want to live this challenging life that Ruth agreed to. And so when her mother-in-law Naomi gave her a way out, she took it. Although it was heartbreaking for her to leave her beloved mother-in-law and sister-in-law, she didn't want to go back to live such a challenging life. She didn't have the same depth of connection with God that made it worth it for her to sacrifice. But Ruth did. And now Ruth goes out to the fields. And she is vastly different than any other woman who was in the field. She goes to the field of Boaz. Now, Boaz was a family member of Naomi. In fact, if you want to really understand the family tree, Elimelech and Naomi, Elimelech was Naomi's husband. Elimelech was Naomi's uncle. In those days, an uncle marrying a niece was extremely common. And Boaz was Naomi's first cousin, which means that he was Elimelech's nephew. And he was a cousin to Naomi and a cousin to Naomi's late sons. And Boaz was the leader of the Jewish people at that time, which, as we stated in the beginning, he was also known as Iftan, the judge, the leader of the Jewish people at that time. And he was the head of the rabbinic court known as the Sanhedrin. And he was a very important, influential rabbinical figure during this time period. He was also an extremely wealthy man who had many fields. And so when Ruth was going to gather grain from one of the fields, Ruth went to Boaz's field, where she felt she would be most protected, being that the owner of the field was family with her mother-in-law and her late husband. And so Ruth goes to the field, and as we said, she is very different from any of the other women in that field. The other poor women were trying their very best to be as provocative as possible. They wanted to be noticed by a man, hoping that someone would marry them and pull them out of their poor misery. And so they would traipse through the fields, conversing with the men. Nowadays, we would just say they were flirting. And Ruth was the complete opposite. She maintained perfect modesty. She took very quietly what she needed. She stayed away from any conversations with any strangers. She was there just to get whatever they needed. She didn't take more than she needed because she didn't want to take advantage of other people's generosity. And she exuded an aura of modesty as she was gathering the sheaves. And Boaz, who was in the field that day, which our sages tell us was a divine inspiration that actually made him go out to the field that day, because normally he would just leave his foreman and his overseers to take care of the fields. But Boaz was in the field that day, and Ruth attracted his attention. Not because she was trying to be attracting, but because he was drawn to her modesty and the spiritual aura that surrounded her. But Boaz didn't say anything to her, especially because he wanted to maintain his level of modesty, and also because it was inappropriate for him to be making conversation with a woman at this time, specifically because he was just mourning the loss of his wife. His wife had just passed away, and he was still in the mourning period. But after Ruth left and went back to her mother-in-law, Boaz inquired, "Who is this woman? Who is this woman that showed up to my field? She's so different than everybody else. She's so different than any of the other women who are coming and they're behaving in such a provocative, immodest fashion." And the people told him, oh, this is Ruth. She's Naomi's daughter-in-law. She just came back from Moab, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And Boaz takes note of her. And I want to pause here and just picture the type of conversation that must have surrounded Ruth wherever she went. You know, nowadays, if we were living this story in our day and age, the story would have gone something like this. Naomi's back in town. She brought with her her daughter-in-law, Ruth. She's a Moabite princess. She wants to be close with God. She's going to the fields. All the WhatsApp chats would be booming. All the emails would be booming. Everybody would be gossiping. Who is this woman? Oh my, why does she think we're going to accept her? Why does she think we're going to let her into the community? Why is she trying to take advantage of her poor mother-in-law? What is she here for? What's her ulterior motive? Right? That's what would have been happening nowadays. And the truth is, that's exactly what was happening then. Just without the WhatsApp chats and without the, the phone conversations. So there, the conversations were taking place in the field and the granary and the threshing ground, wherever people would join together at the well, right? That's where they were talking about her. But no one had anything positive to say about her. The gossip, which, by the way, gossip is not a new thing. Gossip is as old as the hills. So, of course, they were gossiping then. The gossip that surrounded Ruth was extremely negative. In fact, when Boaz inquired about her, all he heard was negativity. Oh, she's never going to be accepted in the Jewish community. She's from the city of Moab. She's the land of Moab where we don't accept converts. And even though the law had been passed that Moabite women were halachically accepted, people don't change as easily as a halachic ruling. People don't change now. People don't change then. And the slander that Boaz heard about Ruth could have completely turned him off from ever being interested in her. But Boaz understood that there must be more to her. And he recognized that he shouldn't listen to the negative gossip that is being told about her. And he was actually quite interested in her. Who is this woman? Who is a woman who left her life of being a princess and came to the land of Israel to live a Jewish life that has so much physical challenge, that has so many hardships? What is it about her that made her join our community? Boaz recognized her incredible perseverance, her incredible connection, and most importantly, the sacrifice of the choice that she made. And when we look at the story of Ruth and we see the choice that she made, we look at her now as a woman to look up to and admire. But that's only because we are learning her story after we see the big picture. But Ruth, when she was living through her choices, she didn't know what her future would become. She didn't know what her reward for this would be. All she saw was the life that she was currently living at that moment. And that was not an easy life. Her limited vision only allowed her to see what we see in our own lives as well. The here and now and the past. That is what our limited vision allows us to see. We see the past and the present, but we're not privy to the future. When we think of Ruth's past and present, we see the beauty and the ease of the life she left behind and the challenge that she faced in her present day. And yet, Ruth didn't just live her life miserable because of the choice that she made. She was happy with her life. She was kind and loving and grateful to her mother-in-law for the opportunity that her mother-in-law had given her of joining the Jewish community. She was steadfast in her relationship with God. She recognized the beauty even during the time of her extreme challenge. And this in itself tells us the value of Ruth's piety. That she didn't need to know the big picture to know that she was making the right choice. She had such faith in God and such connection with God that she wanted this life. She wanted a relationship with spirituality and with godliness, even if her whole life would be physically challenging and quite difficult. But as we know, the story's not over here. Her life did turn into the beauty and glory that she ultimately deserved. And without getting into all of the halachic details of the next part of the story, it's important to know that there is a Jewish custom, a law that is quite complicated to explain in the many nuances that it has, but I'll do my best to just explain the general idea of it. There is a mitzvah called Yibum. Yibum is the mitzvah that if a woman marries a man and does not have any children, and her husband passes away, this man's legacy will be lost because he has no children to bear his name. And so it is a mitzvah for his next of kin to marry this woman to perpetuate his legacy. Now, usually the mitzvah specifically applies to a brother. An unmarried brother should marry this widow, his widowed sister-in-law. Now, nowadays, this mitzvah takes place in different contexts. It is upheld halachically, but not specifically socially. There are ways of getting around it. We're not going to get into all the ramifications of that halachically nowadays, although it is quite fascinating if you're interested to look it up further. But Ruth was in that position where she had been married. Her husband passed away. She did not have any children, but her husband did not have any living brothers. And so the responsibility could have fallen to any other family member, specifically to Boaz, who was a cousin of her late husband and who was now also single because his wife had passed away. And so Naomi encourages Ruth to approach Boaz and ask him to take that responsibility. Now, from Boaz's perspective, he had been really interested and wanting to marry Ruth. He recognized her righteousness. He recognized the beauty of her soul, and he recognized that she would be the right soulmate for him to have their future generations. But he hadn't felt that it was appropriate yet because he had just lost his wife to enter into a new relationship, especially since how would everybody perceive this, because she was a Moabite princess. And like we said, even though the halachic ruling had changed, people's attitudes hadn't changed as quickly. And Ruth was actually the one who propositioned Boaz. And to make a longer story short, they do get married. It was a beautiful marriage. And the offspring of Ruth is what tells us really her true value. So after Ruth and Boaz get married, she becomes pregnant and she has a son. And let's continue looking inside for a moment and we will see in chapter 4 of the book of Ruth, verse 17, Vatikrena lo hashchenot shem lemar yulad ben leNaomi, Vatikrena shmo Oved, hu Avi Yishai, Avi David. His name was Oved. He was named Oved. And who was he? He was the father of Yishai, who was the father of David. Yes, the same David as King David. So Ruth was the great grandmother of King David. Now hold up for a moment. King David, the beginning of the dynasty of Jewish royalty, the ancestor of Mashiach, he must have been born from the most holy lineage. He must have had the greatest yichus, as we say in Yiddish. He must have had the greatest family that he came from. Who was his great grandmother? A Moabite convert. A Moabite convert. But yes, she was deserving of bearing the child who would father King David, of being the ancestress of the dynasty of Jewish royalty, because her value was not the family she came from, but the choices that she made that dictated the family that she created. You know, there's a famous story of the Maggid of Mizrich, who was the teacher of the first Chabad Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya. And the story goes that when he was a young child, he was living with his mother in a small, dilapidated hut. They were very, very poor. And there was a fire in their home. And he and his mother were safe, but his mother was standing outside the home crying hysterically. And his young son turned to the mother and said, "Why are you crying? We've barely had any possessions in our home." And she said, "I'm crying because in our home there was a family tree, a document describing your righteous dynasty, the many, many generations of holy rabbis that came before you. And now it's lost. We don't have the family tree that says where you come from." And this young boy turned to his mother and says, "Don't worry. I will start a new family tree. And I will be the first righteous one in that family tree." It doesn't matter where we come from if we don't make the right choices. We determine whether the generations that come before us are worthy of our generation. What matters most are the generations that come after us, the generations that we create. And the value and the beauty of the generations that we create are not determined by the people who came before us, but they're determined by the choices that we make and the deeds that we do. And that's what we see in Ruth's story. Who did Ruth come from? She came from a terrible, terrible king who oppressed the Jews. Now, the truth is, by the way, let it be known that her father, Eglon, while he was killed by one of the judges, Ehud, in a fascinating story, he merited that his descendant should be King David because of a one-time good deed that he did. But Ruth was the one who perpetuated that legacy because of the choices that she made every single day. And Ruth was the one who didn't just choose God when it was convenient for her and bring God into the life that she was already living, but she actually transformed her entire day-to-day life. She changed her existence 100% from being a Moabite princess to being a Jewish princess. And that involved not just a one-time sacrifice, but daily sacrifices that she endured, that she enjoyed, and that she lived through because this was the life that she chose. You know, oftentimes when we're struck by a boost of spirituality, or we have this moment of awakening where we want to bring more godliness into our life and we want to do something beautiful or something holy or something kind, whatever it is, right? We have those moments when we're inspired. In order to make those moments last, we have to do something that makes a permanent, lasting change. Ruth made a series of changes in her life that were permanent. She left her home. She changed her lifestyle. She changed her value system. We don't have to make such radical changes and choices in order to be connected with God, because we are blessed to have an innate relationship with God that doesn't require us to transform our entire life. But it does require us to make choices that have permanent effects. Because if our choices and our sacrifices are just fleeting and they don't make a real impact, Ruth tells us and urges us to make choices that have permanent impact on our own lives and on the lives of the people who come after us. And that is where we see the beauty in Ruth, because she made those choices before she knew that she would one day marry the leader of the Jewish people and live a beautiful life and be the mother of Oved, who would be the grandfather of David HaMelech. She didn't know that her story would end in that way, where she would be the matriarch of Jewish royalty. When she was making those choices, all she knew was that she wanted to make a choice that would bring her closer to God. That was all she knew at that time. And that was enough for her. That was enough of a reason for her to bring her life to God, to change her life for God. And this tells us the same idea, because we don't know what the future generations look like many years later. All we know is the here and now. And all we can focus on is the here and now. Yes, I see your hand is raised. Sorry, please unmute yourself so that we can hear you. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. B, is it?
Yes, that's right. I love your presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Is not one of the key factors here that we should accept converts, that they are valuable people?
You know, you could have given the rest of the class for me.
Hello.
I'm so glad you mentioned it, because I was getting to it in just a moment. Yes, it is another key factor, which we'll get to. So we're looking at the story from Ruth's perspective in this right now. This tells us that when we are from the same perspective that Ruth has, where we don't see the future, but we just see the here and now, we choose God because we want a relationship with God. And when we are truly earnest in our relationship with God, then it doesn't matter who has come before us. But in the same vein, those who do come before us and their righteousness, they become more powerful to us when we make the right choices. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I once heard something really important that sticks with me a lot, especially when it comes to family lineage. They say that good family lineage is like a bunch of zeros. It's worth nothing unless there's a 1 in front of it. You are the 1. If you have value, then all of your ancestors, the righteous mothers and fathers and their sacrifices in every generation add to your value. But the value of the past is only worth if the present is a 1. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of zeros because it doesn't perpetuate in future generations. And when we look at other people, we need to recognize that as well. So often we meet people and we don't accept them because we're looking at their surroundings. We're looking at where they come from, their families, the communities that they came from previously. We need to really remember that that's just a bunch of zeros. The person standing in front of us is the 1. And the value of 1 doesn't change and can never be minimized by the zeros that come before it. It can enhance it, but it can never take it away. And that is the way we need to look at other people. Specifically, now looking at the story of Ruth from the opposite perspective, from the perspective of the people who were looking at Ruth, their attitude towards Ruth was more than just wrong. It was so narrow-minded. It was truly lacking any intelligence. They saw Ruth, and all they saw was the negativity surrounding her upbringing. And they were the ones who were lacking because they failed to see her value. And when we approach people, specifically, the Torah cautions us and advises us to be especially considerate towards converts and especially kind towards converts because of the challenges of making choices that are so life-changing. And that's something that we need to look up to rather than look down upon. And we can learn from the people in Ruth's circle to not be like them. And when we see individuals, we need to recognize each other for our innate value, for the value of our individual connections with God, not on all the external factors that really don't make a difference, that really don't play a part in determining a person's value. When a person makes a choice to connect with God in such a powerful way. And so to answer your question, be 100% yes. When we look at people and we look at converts, we shouldn't look at where they've come from. We should look at the potential of their future generations. Because if Ruth's potential was to have future generations who would ultimately be King David, King Solomon, and ultimately leading up to King Mashiach, that is the potential of someone who makes a conscious choice to make permanent changes in their life in order to be connected with God. And we can be like Ruth, whether we grew up Jewish or we've never had a relationship with God, and anywhere along that spectrum. Because each one of us every day make a conscious choice and can make the conscious choice to make permanent changes in our lives to bring God into our lives. Those don't have to be radical changes. They could be tiny little changes. But as long as they are lasting, as long as they are permanent in that they transform our lives just a little bit. So if somebody is at the level, and I'll give an example, some of you might connect with, some of you might have to substitute this with your own examples. But for someone who's looking to bring the beauty of Shabbat into their life, Now, for someone who observes Shabbat to the fullest, this might not be the perfect example for them, but for someone who is making the choice to bring Shabbat into their life, that doesn't mean from one day to the next they're going to transform their entire schedule, that every Saturday is going to be lighting candles, not doing anything that is forbidden on Shabbat, and attending synagogue and having meals. That's a big change to do in one moment. But maybe it'll be lighting candles at the correct time and taking the Jewish calendar and looking up the time for lighting Shabbat candles and sticking to it, making that small change into a permanent change. Or to give a different example, someone who decides that they don't want to speak negatively about anybody ever. We don't want to have any lashon hara. Now, we're human. We speak badly about people, sometimes without realizing, and sometimes because we just can't hold ourselves back, and it's wrong. But for someone who's going to say, okay, I'm never speaking bad about anybody again, that's not practical. Because as soon as the moment passes and you hear some juicy gossip, you're really never going to repeat it. You're really going to leave that conversation. It doesn't feel practical to do that. What could feel practical? Maybe from 10:15 to 10:45 every morning, I'm going to stay away from negative speech. That might be something practical. Because if you have that juicy gossip at 10:30 in the morning, you won't say it then. And maybe at 10:45, if you really have the urge, you might say it at 10:45. But for those 15 minutes, you've kept that commitment. And maybe at 10:45, you'll realize you don't have to say it. So you'll stop yourself from saying it then. Those are smaller changes, but they make a much more permanent impact because they're manageable. What Ruth did was radical. And it was permanent because, well, she was Ruth. And that's why she is the ancestress of Mashiach. But we can be a little bit like Ruth. For those of you who are completely like Ruth and change your lifestyle around completely, I take my hat off to you. It's a very, very, very powerful thing that many people do. But I can only speak for myself, and it's very hard to make radical changes at different stages in life that are completely different than everything we're used to. But small changes that are permanent, we can learn from Ruth to become like that. And then each one in our own way, we channel the power of Ruth into our own lives. So there are so many lessons and lifelong learning moments that we can learn from Ruth. I encourage each of you to think about what lesson you can learn from Ruth, whether it's what we've discussed here today or anything else. If you want to share anything, please do. And most importantly, let's look at ourselves and recognize the value of the choices that we make that are like Ruth. And let's look at each other and value one another for the good choices that we each make that make us more like Ruth as well. So if anyone has any questions, please unmute yourself and share. If anyone has any comments or anything they'd like to share, I'd love to hear. Yes.
Mushka, I have to tell you, to be so wise and so young.
Thank you.
I really appreciate, and I enjoyed this very much. This was very well done.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure,
Thank you very much. And coming from you, who is much, much, much wiser than me, I appreciate that.
No, much, much older than you.
Right.
Not much wiser.
Not wiser, but older, right.
Listen,
I'm in the same
I
boat,
can
Natalie.
only
Same boat
pray
as you.
that I will age like all of you. I want to be like all of you when I grow up.
You know, a friend of mine, well, she was an acquaintance, but from synagogue, she was 98 years old and she just passed away.
Oh, wow.
And every Shabbos, I would see her in synagogue. And I said, when I grow up, I want to be just like you.
I guess it
Because
never stops, right? We all just want to grow up. Good, great. I have a long time to grow up. Thank God. Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. I appreciate the feedback. If anybody else has any questions, please unmute yourself. Even if you're not on camera, you can unmute yourself just with your voice. If you have anything you want to share, we'd love to hear from you as well.
You're really an excellent teacher. Excellent.
Oh, thank you. I learn most from my students, so I appreciate
mean,
that.
Wonderful.
All right. Thank you very much, ladies. It was lovely seeing you all, and I look forward to, God willing, next week for what I believe is our last class.
Oh,
And have a wonderful rest of your day. Looking forward to a wonderful week of making great choices, just like Ruth.
Thank you for your help.
thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
ladies.
Have a wonderful week.
Bye-bye.